of 3 webinars put on by the Media Relations and Writing Learning community of ACE. Today we have 3 distinguished panelists to help us through the next 60 minutes for a conversation on what we're calling underserved audiences in overlooked media. So we have 3 people with us today. We're going to start with Hub Brown. He is today from Syracuse, New York, where he is the Associate Dean for Research, Creativity, International Initiatives, and Diversity. He's an associate professor with the Newhouse School of Public Communications there. And he will become the Dean of the University of Florida's College of Journalism and Communications on July 1st. In addition to his own on-air reporting experience, he's been a member and active in the National Association of Black Journalists, and I believe in the National Association of Hispanic Journalists as well. Brian Pollard is our second guest. He is the Associate Director and former President of the Native American Journalists Association. He has completed a Knight Fellowship at Stanford, where he studied the value of an indigenous free press and strategies for increasing press freedoms in Indian country. He is also pursuing a master's in journalism with an emphasis on documentary filmmaking. Already has one that has a documentary that was released, I believe, 2 to 3 years ago. Our third panelist is ACE's own Ricardo Vela. He is with the University of California Agriculture and Natural Resources Program Manager for Servicio de Información en Español, and has won multiple ACE awards for his work on diversity. He is also a veteran of, are you both Univision and Telemundo, or only one of them, Ricardo?
Both Telemundo and Univision.
So, so with that, what we're going
and
to
CNN as well.
What we're going to do first is invite each of them to make an opening statement, and you have wide leeway as we have discussed, but if you could kind of talk in general about the purpose of the particular media that you have had experience with, and what needs it meets that are not perhaps being met by mainstream media or general circulation media. So why don't we start with that? Hub, can you kick us off?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. It's great to be a part of this discussion, and I'm honored actually to sit on this panel with these gentlemen who have been such leaders in the work that they're doing, getting out and telling stories. And I teach people to tell stories. I've been a broadcast journalist for a number of years, and a professor of broadcast and digital journalism, both here and earlier before I came to Syracuse at the University of Nebraska, the state that I'm from. And in those places, one of the things that I have really worked to explore with students is connecting, finding ways to connect and do storytelling that really matters in all kinds of communities. And I think one of the things that we wanted to talk a little bit here about, what areas of media are not being addressed generally, what voices are not being heard, what outlets are not being that people are not connecting with. And in thinking about this, I think that one of the big things, one of the big experiences of recent times in my career was doing a documentary about African American owned radio stations around the country. And in order to do that, I went all over the place. I had great interviews with all kinds of people, with David Dinkins, the late mayor of New York City, because he had a program on a Black-owned radio station in the city, all the way to a station that existed in Kansas City, Missouri for a lot of years and was being passed down from one generation to the next. And in those, what you get is the sense of connection with the community, that people, radio is such an intimate medium. And so of course is television, but radio is really, it's right there. It's in your shirt pocket. It's in your ear. It's so close, and people develop relationships with those folks that are on the air. And at a community level, those stations and those outlets can become real rallying points. They are rallying points to get people to do things in their community, to start new programs, to register to vote, to do all kinds of different things. And so one of the things that I think is super important as we begin and talk about this discussion is to think about that connection. Think about those connections with minority-owned media, because in a very, very real sense, that is, if you can build connections with those outlets, you're really building outlets. You're building connections that are going to last a very long time, and that are going to be very, very useful to the people who are listening, and very, very useful to you as communicators. And those can be very strong. But in order to do it, you're going to have some source credibility. You're going to have, you're going to need to be able to connect with those audiences on issues those folks care about. And there's a lot of that. And I hope we get to talking about that. Today is the day that the stimulus bill is being heard and I think being finally passed in Congress. Part of that stimulus bill has a multi-billion-dollar fund that is addressing the discrimination that has occurred over decades against Black farmers around the United States. And there used to be 1 million Black farmers in 1910. And I say this as an example of the kinds of stories that are out there. So a century ago, 1 million Black farmers, now there's about 45,000, 2,000 in the state of Florida. And it's a tragedy over generations of discriminatory practice, predatory lending, those sorts of things where people have just lost land. But the farmer losing, really fighting to keep his or her land and contribute and do the things that he needs to do, that's an old story. I remember covering that story in the 80s out in the Great Plains. I remember talking to ranchers in the sandhills of Nebraska about being worried about losing their ranches. There are common threads in a lot of these kinds of stories, common threads about the need for people to continue a way of life, about the need for people to have reliable food sources, the need for people to support workers on those farms, that cut across all kinds of different categories. And so when you're looking to reach out to those audiences, I think one of the most important things you can do is to think about those commonalities. Think about the things we all want together, because that's where connection begins. And then we will, and we're going to be talking about here, then I think it's a lot of talking about some of the individual and historical challenges these communities have had. And that just means getting a little background going. And so hopefully we can talk about that some more as we go forward here.
Excellent, thanks. That's a great start, Hub. Let's move over to Brian. 3 to 5 minutes on your piece.
All right, thanks, Chris. So I'd like to start just by kind of establishing the landscape of what Native America looks like in the United States. So the indigenous communities across the US are made up of 574 federally recognized tribes and dozens more that are state recognized. From the tip of the Florida Peninsula all the way up to the Arctic Circle. Each one of these communities has a distinct culture and history, traditions, language that really makes them unique on the planet. And yet what we continue to see from mainstream media is this treatment of Native communities, not only as kind of a monolithic block, but really they continue to perpetuate stereotypes and tropes about Native people that are often based on kind of historic caricatures of Native people that are part of kind of the colonization and the suppression of Native peoples. And so what we encourage, I work at the Native American Journalists Association. I'm the associate director, and we work with mainstream media quite a bit. And what we encourage them to do is really to focus on building relationships with those communities. The best way to move past those stereotypes, which are based on ignorance, is to reach out to build relationships with whatever tribal communities might be in your area, or communities that may have a perspective on whatever reporting that you're working on. Develop relationships, develop sourcing, develop trust, so that some of the historic bad blood that exists between that community and media because of those poor depictions can begin to be healed, and those relationships can begin to facilitate communication and understanding, so that that their voices and their perspectives can be incorporated into contemporary stories, that they can communicate their lived experience, and so that media can begin to weave them into the fabric of contemporary society, rather than continuing to silo them off as a separate community. And so that's something that I really that needs to be, that I hope we're able to explore a little bit more in this webinar.
Thanks for that, Brian. Ricardo, how about you?
Yes, thank you. Well, thank you for having me here. I just want to talk about something that right now we take for granted. And just not that many years ago, 40, 50 years ago, it was not even thought about, which is the niche in the media. Right now, if you're right-wing conservative, you can find the places where you're going to gather your information. If you're left to the left as can go, you're going to find, whether it's online or some sort of TV channel, you're going to find radio stations, newspapers, etc., cater to that audience. In 1961, four businessmen, Latino businessmen, Mexican American, most of them, one Cuban, have a vision of creating a niche for Latino, Spanish-speaking audiences. Until then, the only way Latinos were gathering information was through newspapers, some of them published in Spanish, but owned by white companies. And there were subjects to be told stories from the perspective of the white reporters. In 1960, there were only 3.9 Latinos in newsrooms in the United States. Most of them were along the border with Mexico. In the 50s and 60s, there was one person, Ruben Salazar, who became one of the first Latinos to work for an English media Los Angeles Times at the time. He was a columnist and a reporter, and he started bringing information about Latinos in a way that nobody before had done. In 1967, for instance, the Times published an article about Latinos in East LA, and he says, "Tawny taco joints and rolling king cantinas, the reek of cheap wine, the fumes of frying tortillas in the machine gun patter of slang Spanish." That was what the Times wrote about Latinos in East LA. Rather than inform and gain audience within the Spanish-speaking Latinos or the Latinos by themselves, they were creating more division because they were deepening the stereotypes of the population in the States. Mm-hmm. So comes 1961. Finally, there's a forum on which Latinos are able to see themselves. They're going to be hearing the news that are relevant for them. And this concept of niche information starts. Right now, the pie remains the same. The players are way too many. And that's one of the successes of the Latino media outlets, because they had been catering to this niche, to this community for the past 50, 60 years in a way that is relevant to their audience. For instance, when I was the news anchor and producer in San Diego for Univision. Also, I had a radio show. I remember that day. It was the day that the panda, a little panda, was born. Of course, CBS, NBC, Fox, everybody else run the first headline. The first story was about the panda. The second story was about the panda. The third story about it was something related to the panda. We started with the story about a Latino brutally attacked by a Border Patrol agent and his family. And that was our leading story, that was our second story, and that was our third story in a different angles. All of them community-oriented angles. I remember that day in my radio show, we dedicated 2 hours for the radio for people to vent out their concerns, their fears, their outrage about that. And, you know, like Hab said, radio is a very intimate media because people react right away. When you are on the news and broadcasting on TV, you're talking to the camera, but you don't know the reaction of the audience right away until later. Radio is right there. People start calling you and they talk there, you know, what is there, what they feel, how they feel. They cry with you. So this has been the only way Latinos have been able to learn about their communities, to express their outrage and fears in a society that normally, until 1961, refers them as the minority nobody knows. That's how they were referred. Talking about radio, May 20, 2006, never the country had seen Latinos and those numbers marching through the streets of the main cities in the United States. San Antonio, New York, Chicago, LA, San Diego, everywhere. On the thousands, 100,000, 500,000. I remember in San Diego, there were 25,000 people. Never, ever the city of San Diego had such a number on a march. And that was mainly against criminalizing immigrants in the United States. It was against and pro an immigration reform, and it was immigrants losing their fear of deportation, and it was promoted by radio stations. So that's the power of the radio. That's the power of broadcasting. As a personal experience in the Coachella Valley, where I was my last gig as a broadcaster, and I was a news director and a news anchor. We run a campaign to register new citizens, residents who were to become new citizens, and also new voters. Our goal was probably 1,500 at the most. We got 10,000 through the campaign on radio and TV. It was amazing to see how people reacted to that, the need that it was there. And working with community organizations, I personally had seen the change of those communities, the empowerment of the Latino community, because there was no forum before. And now we're giving them the forum.
Ricardo, those are some great examples of needs being met that are not being met by other forms of media. Why don't we kind of shift this into a discussion of do's and don'ts? How do you form those relationships? How do you gain that trust? What is the history that ag communicators need to know when they approach people in Black, Hispanic, Native American media? So let's go back to Hub to kick off this part.
Oh, sure, yeah. So I like to brag sometimes that one of my first awards that I ever got in my broadcasting career was in the agriculture category, because I was a kid who came from the inner city and went to the farm and listened to farmers, listened to ranchers, listened to people on the land, but not only them, but went into town and listened to the lenders and listened to people who are working in markets and listen to workers on those plots of land, all of those kinds of things, because what a journalist is supposed to do first and foremost is listen, learn to listen. And you're gonna have to, if you really want to reach out to populations, you're going to have to think like a journalist. And I know that a lot of the people who are in probably on this call are either journalist adjacent, or some of you probably were former journalists, and that's great. And so I think one of the big things to do is to go back and listen to those, to go back to those skills a little bit, because in going to communities that you don't interface terribly often, you've got to do it with open hands, and you've got to do it with the intention to hear them, and to not feel that this is about a debate. This is their reality. The people who live in inner cities in the United States that have dealt with generations of discrimination at the hands not just of individuals or lenders, but government. One of the things that I show my students here is I show them historical maps that were done in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, that were the color-coded housing maps of cities. And so I will show them the city of Syracuse, and you will see all of the redlining that takes place in a city like Syracuse, where literally the highways that bisect this city, that crisscross through, Interstate 81 that goes north-south, Interstate 90 that goes east-west, that's where all the red line neighborhoods are. Those are the neighborhoods with no power, and those are the neighborhoods where Black folks lived. And that there's nothing. I mean, you can talk all day if you want about what the other side of all that was, but those people had that lived reality, and it framed what they did, and so and how they sort of interfaced government and things like that, and they struggled for a long time about that. And so we're having a conversation in this city about taking down the north-south freeway and replacing it with a neighborhood grid. And we're having to go back and talk about how those neighborhoods were uprooted to build the highway in the first place. And so when you do that, now you've got to go in there and you've got to listen to their reality. You've got to come back and be faithful to that reality when you're producing those stories, when you're talking to those people, when you're showing those people the kinds of things that you can offer. Because when you know their reality, then you know what you can offer them. You know what you can say to them. You know what kinds of things are happening as far as that's concerned. So you get used to doing those things. And you get used to doing it across different neighborhoods. I was listening to Brian talking about the things that are going on in Indian country, and I had come, I came from one place where there's fairly dominant series of Indian nations with very, very specific concerns, and they, the Sioux, the Pawnee, those folks out in the plains, to come here to central New York, where it's the Onondaga, the Haudenosaunee people here, the Onondaga, the Oneida, with a different set of concerns, much of it tied to the relationship to land and things like that, and a lot of it tied to the relationship of the government, because they're both dealing with the same US government. There's some very difficult situations there. And so you've got to learn to listen to those things. You step outside of that. You're going to say something, Ricardo?
Yeah, yes, adding to what you're saying, which is really, really relevant, is if you're going there as a journalist, leave the stereotypes in the newsroom.
Absolutely.
First and foremost. Second, one of the biggest mistakes most people do, where they're trying to reach out to the Latino community, and we're going to speak about the Latino community, because I mean, I'm not that knowledgeable about other communities, but is we speak Spanish. We have some cultural traits, similar cultural traits, but we're so different. Know your audience, know who you are going to reach out to, know who you are going to cover. The Latino in Florida, in Miami, is totally different than the Latino in Fort Lauderdale, just to mention another city in Florida.
Absolutely.
Or the Latino in Austin, Texas, or San Antonio, or Houston. I mean, needless to say, the Latino in California is a totally different entity. Mm-hmm. New Mexico, Arizona, we have things in common, but we are so different, and everyone has a different approach. Similarities is family, job, education, but that's true for any American.
Oh, that's so true. That is so true. We want the same things. We all want the same things, but we're coming at this from different places a lot of times, because we're coming at it from different historical experiences.
Yes.
We want a better education for our kids. We want to be able to be the next generation that does better than the generation previous to it. Everybody wants those things, don't they? Yes. But you're finding a lot of situations where people are dealing with varying different kinds of obstacles to that. And that's the same way in the Black experience, both a rural and an urban Black experience, or a Southern and a Northern
exactly.
experience.
Exactly. Like for instance, right now we have a crisis within Latino farm workers, because a lot of them, a huge percentage, especially in Central and Southern California, they are indigenous, from Oaxaca, from Michoacan. They don't speak Spanish. They understand very little Spanish, and they're trying to give them the message of COVID, how to treat COVID, the vaccines, and so on and so forth in Spanish, instead of reaching out in the languages that they do understand. That's one. The other one, for instance, is that when you want to cover a story, is have the decency of knowing a little of the culture of the community you are going to. Once again, I have seen a lot of reporters going there with not even knowing anything about the Latino community at all, and they were just assigned the story because probably that's what they got from the newsroom, from the news director, the assignment editor. But do a little bit of research before you go and cover the story. Now, if your intention is to reach out, also get to know the community you're working with. You'll be surprised what you learn from them, what you how easy it is to gain their trust. However, if you lose their trust, it's so hard to get it back.
Excellent.
One example that I want to mention, for instance, stereotyping, people think all the Latinos are Catholic and all the Latinos are Democrats. No. Just in Texas, 20% of the Latinos right now are converting to Islam.
I'd like to give Brian a little time to weigh in on this too. Brian, could you comment a little bit on the monolithic or non-monolithic nature of the communities you're working with?
Yeah, well, I'd like to second everything that's already been said. I mean, Native American communities experience many of these same types of discrimination from government. A really good recent example to look at is the Keeps Eagle settlement that recently happened, where, to use the term that Hub mentioned, Native American farmers were literally redlined out of farm loans. That was actually a historic settlement that the Obama administration reached with Native American farmers, and now has been set up into a fund that's essentially distributing those monies that should have been distributed back in the day to farmers today. And so that's a really good example of some of the discrimination that we know has happened. But we also see discrimination in the media, and I think that is should be something that all journalists and communicators in general should be concerned with, because it has led to a lot of distrust. Native American communities can be quite insulated geographically, because oftentimes they are in a kind of a reservation setting. But also I think it's really, it's psychologically as well, because of the harm that has been perpetuated through stereotypes in media for generations. And so it's really incumbent upon today's media professionals to begin to heal those relationships by reaching out, learning about those tribes, learning about their history, learning about the harms that your university may have actually contributed to. One thing that should be mentioned is the land grant universities that were established by the Morrill Act. Many of those profits that established those universities came from lands that were taken from indigenous peoples. And those are still things that those people have never been compensated for. And so I think that it's important that all, particularly the land grant universities, understand what that historic relationship with those tribes might be, and really reach out and start developing those connections and those relationships to begin to heal that and find ways to partner with those tribes, because their perspectives are very important, particularly in the ag space. There are many tribes that are doing incredibly innovative work in the agriculture sector, whether it's reclaiming grasslands, reclaiming wetlands, finding ways to bring back species, bringing bison back onto the range. I mean, there's just waterways, fisheries, I mean, you name it, there is all kinds of innovation happening across Indian country in the ag sector. And all of that stuff is rich storytelling. And I think it's great opportunities for media to partner with them to develop those relationships and to do great storytelling.
Wow. Thanks for that, Brian. We're going to now open it up to questions and answers. So if anyone would like to ask a question, you can either put it in the chat box, or I believe, Heather, do you have a way of knowing if someone raises their hand, or how it's best to let people in to speak? Well, if someone wants to ask a question, you can try, like I say, either speaking now or putting it in the chat box. And in the meantime,
Chris, while we're waiting on people to jump in with their questions, I'd actually like to piggyback on something that Ricardo said about
Sure.
niche, because many tribes have moved into the media space to start to tell their own stories in their own voice. And there is a very rich tribal media landscape across the United States, tribal radio, tribal newspapers, newsletters, television shows, that's happening, all around the country, on every platform that you can imagine. And those are really, I think, ripe for partnerships. Mainstream media or non-Indigenous journalists should look into the tribal media landscape and see who those practitioners are, because they're going to have the sources, they're going to have the connections, they're going to have all the things that a journalist or a communicator might need, and I think they're going to be maybe a little bit more open to partnership on kind of that communicator to communicator level. And so I would encourage everyone, if you go to the NAJA website, naja.com, under our Red Press Initiative, which is one of our programs, we actually have a tribal media map, and it shows you where all the tribal, or most of the tribal media outlets are located, and a lot of those include contact information. So I would encourage everyone to look at that.
Yeah, if I might add, actually, right now, social media is such a huge place for Latinos to gather their information. If we're talking about, some demographics, 45 to 65 use Facebook. The rest, mainly Instagram. Even through Instagram, you can connect to the newsrooms. You can share their stories. They are constantly looking into that. Create partnerships with your local TV stations, newspaper, local news weeklies. Normally, that's what they are, or monthlies. Try to connect with them. Invite them to have a meeting. The more you are connected to them, the more you're going to work. They're going to be willing to work with you. Remember, especially in Spanish media, I'm not part of it anymore, but it is very local. It's about community, what the community needs, the information that you can provide to the community. That's gold to our newsrooms. So think about that, connect, create those partnerships. You can start with a reporter that you normally see, invite the reporter to come over to you, invite he or she to an event that you are organizing, if that's the case. Let them be part of it. Let them take a little ownership so you can get that in exposure and retribution, start building that relationship, and it's a win-win, trust me.
Absolutely. I think that building that relationship, that's such a great point, Ricardo. I mean, building that relationship in those communities, those people are going to start to tell you things, tell you stories that you can plug into your institutions and say, so what's happening on this particular front? Is there an answer to this question that these folks in the community are asking? Are there these things, are there concerns that these particular programs are addressing? Are, within inner city communities or within rural communities, within communities of color, you're going to find that folks are going to be very activated about those very local concerns. And so if what you can do is is be that connector, be that convener, be that organization that says, these folks have this concern, and our agency and our institution are doing these things in this area. Let's get these folks together. Let's start to convene things. You're going to find that there's going to be some rich storytelling that you're going to be able to give to people in media outlets, and they will tell those stories of the communities. They'll be happy with you. The people in the communities will be happy with you, and you've got something there that you can move forward with in terms of building a relationship.
Yeah,
it's going to be very, very important.
A big don't. If you decide to cross that bridge and establish that relationship, expect the call and expect this question: can I interview you on camera if that's a TV? And you better say yes. Because if you say no, I don't want interviews, I don't want to be on camera, you lost that relationship forever. Because you have to remember, when you're working in broadcasting, you want the news for today. Yesterday news is no news anymore. And my deadlines are every 5 minutes, because I have to create content for the 4 o'clock, the 5 o'clock, the 6 o'clock, the 11 o'clock, the 10 o'clock, for Facebook, for Instagram, for all the social media, for the website. So constantly the reporters are creating content for those media outlets. And when you say no, it's like you are closing the doors of something that I'm willing to dedicate time, but my time is important as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the whole thing about deadlines, it is important to remember that the concept of deadlines is pretty much over. You know what your deadline is if you're an organization? It's right now. That's the deadline. We're going to get something out the door right now. That's what I'm teaching these students here about all the time. And so when you're talking to media outlets, you got to keep that in mind. They're going to take something. They want to take something that you're doing and turn it right around so that it's on social or it's on the web, and then it's going to be whenever the next newscast is. You know, it's 2 o'clock, a quarter to 3 Eastern time here. It's going to be the 5 o'clock show or the 4 o'clock show in a lot of places now. But it's right now, because that's what's going out on social, and the social is going to be used to drive people to the broadcast.
Yeah. And I have to chime in here and say that's also, you know, what Hub and Ricardo just mentioned. They're also cautionary tales for people who are trying to cover Indigenous issues, because that mentality of, we have to get the news right now. We're going to come in, we're going to do our reporting, and we're going to go back and tell the story and get it on social and do all those things. What it leads to is a parachuting in to do your story. And that does not build trust. That actually can be harmful, particularly when you're dealing with an Indigenous community that has already suffered harm for decades, centuries. And so in many respects, your approach to covering those Indigenous stories has to be kind of counterintuitive to the demands of the newsroom, right? You have to be willing to put someone, or maybe even a group of people, on a beat that covers the Indigenous issues, and that will take the time to develop those relationships and will not be completely driven by getting the story in on deadline, getting the story right now, and then going on and doing the next thing. Because that's really the only way that you're going to foster that trust and be able to really get the perspective, the authentic perspective of those communities, right? And so I hear everything that is being said. I just want to caution people that it can make your reporting more difficult in the long run.
Yeah, no, and I agree 100% with you, because that's from, if we're talking about the reporters going to Latino communities, for instance, even if it is a Latino news media that is covering something within the Latino community, you have to use the same cautionary statement that you just mentioned, because it is very relevant to treat with respect those communities. And culturally, speaking, they're very different in every community. But if we're talking about as university trying to give exposure to research or to programs and reach out to the communities, that's when I said, if you send a press release or you create that relationship with a reporter, be willing to be on camera at moment's notice, because that's exactly what you're telling them by sending the press release or building that relationship. Is, as a reporter, I don't expect that relationship and then no, I won't be able to interview. I will be ready next month, because we think on Academia Times, and Academia Times is totally different than the rest of the world.
These are all great points. I wanted to build on a question that Pam sent about building relationships with both individual journalists and target media outlets. What I hear from all three of you is that the parachute journalism could do more harm than good. How do we give ourselves space to create relationships not under the pressure of a deadline? So often our contact is sort of transactional. I need something from you right now. How do you get past that in a world where, like Hub says, deadline is now all the time?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a big difficulty, but I think that one way to do that is, I think, really to find ways to reach out to people outside of crisis, outside of that deadline, and that just means that's an investment of time. That's investing in time with an organization, with a news organization, when you might have some information, but you're not desperate to get something on right now. You get something out there, but you want to be a resource. You want to be able to give people resources. If I can always go back to my time as a journalist, and I'm thinking, all right, I'm doing this story now, but I want to have these other stories sort of lined up. I want to have other things that I can do, some really interesting pieces. And if I'm doing that in a television space, I'm going to want to have, some real facts, some background, but I'm also going to want to have people at the center of that story. I want to be able to have access to people, because the best stories are about people. The best stories put people at the center of them. And if you want to put African-American people, we want to put Black people at the center of them, what you're going to want to do is take some time and listen and gain trust. Just like so many communities of color, they have been betrayed so often. And they see media as folks who literally do parachute in when there's a crisis, when something terrible has happened in the community, when something bad. It's like, y'all only show up when somebody's gotten shot.
Yeah.
Right. And that's just, you can't, you've got to be able, I think, as communicators, to reach out to journalists and journalism organizations outside of crisis, give them information, and then tie them to people with interesting and involved and good stories, and stories that are different, maybe some solutions journalism.
And if I can just jump in real quick on your point, I agree with everything that you just said. Mm-hmm. But it can't be incumbent upon the individual journalist to just do that on their spare time. The newsroom, their editor, the organization has to support that. They have to understand, in order for you to do your job properly, we need to give you the time and space on the clock to participate in the community things. It may not be direct reporting. You may not be on deadline, but we recognize that this is an important element of you being able to report on this community. And so it has to be supported by the newsroom and the organization.
Here.
Yes, I agree 100%. And that's part of building those relationships, because it's a two-way street. We build that relationship as a news entity with that community in a way that we can sit down at the table and talk about those issues. We can give you this kind of stories, but we need this amount of time. And we can work with you on this. And also avoid that parachuting reporting that is only when people go to East LA when there's a shooting or there's something going on like that, drugs or, it bleeds and leads, that kind of stuff. But the other thing is, it goes both ways. As a journalist, you need to create that relationship with that community. As a community, you need to create that relationship, not only with a reporter, but with a news director, with a producer, with people that really call the shots. As a reporter, you can only sell the story up to a point. And I'm going to give you an example. CNN, I was working for CNN. They sent me to Texas because in El Paso, Texas, there was a story on the New York Times printed story that the General Hospital in El Paso, Texas was bankrupt because all the Mexican women who came to give birth there for anchor babies. So they sent me to cover the story. I went there. I knew very well, that's my hometown. I knew the director of the General Hospital. Talking to him, we were talking and he said, Ricardo, there's certain truth to the story. 1% of these women do not pay their bills. It's 1%. The reason we are bankrupt is because the county and the state are cutting our funds because they don't want us to serve that 1%. So I called my producer and I said, the story is not as such. This is the story. This is a reality of the story. My producer says, I want you to cover the story that you went sent to cover. And I said, well, there's no story there. The story, I quit it. I stopped working for CNN at that point.
Wow.
Because I was not, the only thing I had as a reporter for my community was my integrity. And I wasn't going to sell my integrity over a story, nor for CNN, nor for CBS or ABC or whomever. And that's why after 35 years working on broadcasting, I could say that up to the last year, one thing that I kept was my honesty and my integrity as a journalist.
You're dealing with you're dealing with people who want to do good work. You're dealing with people who want to make a positive impact when you're talking about reporters that are out there just trying to tell people stories. And so in order to do that, you got to make it easy. You got to make it a little bit easier for them to do that. You've got to know a little bit about the organizations that they represent. And I have to say, corporate lineage, for want of better word, actually does matter. Who owns the station in your area that you're talking about? Is it a Hearst station? Is it a Sinclair station? There are different takes on that. There are different resources that are being used in different stations. There are different amounts of resources that reporters have. And there's almost different attitudes to the different relationships to the communities. So it's, in addition to finding out what those reporters' priorities are, you probably do want to look at what station management is doing and watch those, watch the stations, read the papers, and see what their output is, and find ways to offer them things that, in terms of information, that can improve their relationship with their communities and improve your relationship with those communities as well.
Well, we're getting toward the end here. We have just a couple minutes left. Was wondering if maybe you could address what are the biggest obstacles or the unique challenges in better engagement with audiences of color?
I think one of the things we talked about a lot is trust. And I think that it does come down to that. It comes to trust and listening to perspectives that are not your The three of us have had to do that. We've each had to make careers out of that. Because if you're in the United States and you're telling stories in audiences of all kinds in the United States, you're going to have to learn how to do that. And so understanding those perspectives of those communities of color that many journalists who are not members of those communities have not had to do, that's a lift. That's a lift. And so trust, I think, and gaining trust is going to be about understanding and doing a little bit of work to understand those perspectives and understand why people are saying Black Lives Matter and why people are really upset when somebody says, well, all lives matter. Well, yeah, we knew that, but not all lives are under threat, are they? Not similarly. And so perspective is important. Perspective is everything, and facts and perspective really get us down. Facts and context get us down to the truth. So keep those kinds of things in mind as you're going out there. That's going to be very important.
Yeah, I will say for the Latino community, if you really want to engage the Latino community, whether they're first just recent immigrants, first generation, second generation, is not only for the person to be bilingual, but be bicultural. Latinos can speak no longer Spanish, but the culture is there. It's embedded in the DNA. Is after, it doesn't get lost. So be respectful to that culture. You want to engage them, know the culture of Latinos. Let them see that you care. So you will have the trust. You will gain that, but it's also, I repeat, it's very easy to lose the trust and very hard to regain.
Yeah, and I would, I second all those things. I mean, trust is absolutely imperative, particularly when you're covering Indigenous communities. And one thing that I will caution anyone who is non-Indigenous looking to cover those issues is to check your bias at the door and always, find ways to understand where you might be even unconsciously perpetuating some sort of stereotype or trope about Native people. NAJA actually has a series of reporting guides that we have published on our website to help journalists understand what some of these common traps are when covering Native people and when depicting them. And it helps to kind of keep what might be an unconscious bias in check. We actually have released a bingo card, and you can go through and look at all the stereotypes and tropes that are commonly perpetuated about Native people. And if you have any of those in your story, then you need to revisit that and see how you can do it differently. And so I encourage everyone in mainstream, particularly folks who are non-Indigenous, if you're covering Indigenous issues, know that there is probably some bias lurking in your consciousness somewhere, and just be aware of it and take the extra steps necessary to check that bias and to make sure you're not perpetuating stereotypes.
Well, thanks. Your website sounds like a great resource to take those first steps. So we are at the end of our hour. So thank you, everyone, for attending, for your questions, for your attention. But most of all, of course, thank you to our three panelists for sharing their experience and their insights. We really appreciate all three of you, and we couldn't have done a panel like this without you. So so thanks, and that will wrap up today.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.